right. Well, again, I'm Dave Walsh, and I'm going to speak first about one of the two provisos we're going to be hearing about today. This is the so-called EPD study proviso, and also share a few perspectives from some in the construction industry. So wanted to start out first, like, what is a proviso? And a proviso is simply something that is in the state budget that provides specific instructions around use of a money, typically for funding a study, doing research, things like that. And the reason that there are provisos, or one of the reasons, is that it allows folks to study and get information about a particular topic prior to making legislation. So that's one of the main reasons. Now, there we go. And then specifically this EPD proviso, this proviso was managed by the Department of Enterprise Services at the state of Washington. These are the folks that manage many of the construction projects for the state. And what this proviso did is it convened a construction industry work group. And in a nutshell, our charge was to study EPDs and how they might be applied to state-funded projects. And then finally, the proviso required that DES pull together a summary report back to the legislature to help inform policymakers and legislators about the key concepts and issues related to embodied carbon. So more specifically, what this proviso did was it helped define EPDs in the context of this legislation. I know that most of the folks on this call are super familiar with EPDs and what those definitions are, but one has to understand that this is new territory for a lot in the legislature. I also talked about how one would apply and use EPDs and clarify the definition of how EPDs are to be used and perhaps ways that they're not intended to be used. The proviso also requested that we provide an understanding of what could be potential metrics or ways to measure reductions in embodied carbons on state-funded projects, and to, in a very high level, identify carbon reduction strategies, select or suggest rather pilot projects, and then create a education or standards brief. So who was involved with this proviso? It was a good cross-section of various groups. And so you can see that, that product manufacturers were well represented. The ones that are in bold are the ones that tended to be a little bit more involved or attended most of the meetings. But you can see that there was product manufacturers, trade organizations, also construction organizations like the AGC of Washington, and a selection of various sizes of general and subcontractors. Also involved were folks from structural engineering community. I also was involved, and public agencies. So in addition to DES, the Department of Commerce, who managed the other proviso that Monica will talk about, they were an active participant in this and kind of helped a little bit of the cross-pollination of knowledge there. CLF, University of Washington, was well represented in the discussions here, as were NGOs and environmental organizations, specifically the Blue-Green Alliance and the Washington Environmental Council. Also invited were a few other folks, an energy efficiency company, which, honestly, I'm not quite sure how that intersects with the embodied carbon topic so specifically, and a public affairs consultant. So this proviso, we began our work back in August, and we had a total of 4 meetings. And then, as required by the proviso, DES authored a report and submitted it back to the legislature in 2022. In a really sort of high-level summary, we said that in terms of making legislations, the EPD definition is already defined by ISO 14025. No need to reinvent the wheel, but good to know that that is the standard that should be referenced and be in the definition of EPDs and in any future legislation. The report also talked about how EPDs should be used. They're great in terms of comparing like materials, so steel to steel, wood to wood, concrete to similar strength of concrete, but they should not be used to compare across different materials. So, and that's primarily because each material has its own product category rule, which could have slightly differing scopes in terms of what was included in the LCA. So that was an important concept to get out there to legislators. There's some concern that there might be some apples and orange comparisons going on. In terms of measuring embodied carbon reductions, one possible approach, and this was fairly simple, but to look at the industry average for each category of materials, and then multiply that by the quantities of materials in a given project, at the design stage, to define for that project a business as usual emissions baseline. And then as that project moves into construction, materials are procured, there's a better understanding of the quantity of installed materials, do that same calculation with those product specific EPDs, the actual quantities, and understand what the baseline is of the project and compare that to, or what the emissions are of that specific project and compare it to the baseline. And then finally, one of the thoughts about in the report was that holistic greenhouse gas reductions is really more than procurement. The focus of EPDs is tied very closely to procurement, but there are many other levers that the state should be considering. So in terms of looking beyond the proviso, and in my opinion, there are some topics that need some future study or implementation into state-funded projects. And one of that key ones is outreach and education to product manufacturers. So there is a big difference in terms of the knowledge of embodied carbon and the amount of data out there when you look at large and small manufacturers. So, I did a quick study or a quick look on, EC3, taking concrete as an example. There's, in terms of valid EPDs, there's over 1,600. But when you look at, the number of manufacturers that have the EPDs, it's really only 3 or 4. And so the state has, upwards of 40 or more concrete manufacturers. So that sort of bespeaks to, there are a lot of folks that need to be generating EPDs to be able to comply with any sort of future legislation. That ties into the second point that we would like to see some financial assistance for those smaller manufacturers. The state of Oregon, for example, had a program which helped generate EPDs for all different sizes of concrete manufacturers in Oregon. We would like to see that in future legislations, not just as an aspiration, but part of the legislation. One of the thoughts that came out of the discussions was the difference between buy clean and build clean. So the legislation, which Kirsten will talk about later in the presentation, that's buy clean. So that's very procurement focused. But thinking about maybe a larger picture here, building clean is a little bit more of an expansive definition. And so some of those opportunities that could happen before and after procurement could include things like project scoping. So this is really addressed to state owners, state agencies. Are they right sizing the projects? Are they putting their expectations for long service life for their buildings out there, and importantly, budgeting for that? And then are they setting measurable expectations in both the design RFP and in the construction RFP? That really sets the whole project off on the right footing to maximize greenhouse gas reductions with embodied carbon. Moving into things that would be in the sort of designer's purview, use of life cycle assessment. So before a particular project, so to speak, picks a lane with a particular material for the structural or other systems? Has there been a life cycle assessment in the early phases of design to test and validate if that's the most carbon efficient solution that also meets the other requirements of cost and schedule and program? And then finally, for the designers, having model embodied carbon language in the specifications is super important. Obviously, good procurement is set up by good specs that are specific on what they're requiring. I'll point you to the Carbon Leadership Forum's website. They also have some model embodied carbon language for specifications. So moving into construction, some opportunities beyond procurement is also model bid language. This is a new topic for some contractors and a lot of suppliers. And so having model bid language that general contractors can put into their instructions to bidders, their bid packages would help get a better response. Standardized templates, tools, and databases. Monica, again, will talk about databases, but in terms of templates and tools, are there some standardized tools that could be developed for general contractors in terms of evaluating bids or measuring the carbon as they go through the construction process? And then finally, embodied carbon is also a part of the actual construction activity. So, whether it's electrification of equipment on the job site, using lower carbon fuels, being very efficient with your, deliveries to reduce, idling emissions. These are also important topics, and I would point you to some really good presentations in the December 2021 CL and CLF presentation, especially the one from Emmy LaFontaine is very great. So I'll just close with a few caveats and some issues to keep in mind when crafting future legislation. Databases are great and disclosure is great. However, just because something's in a database doesn't mean that it will be available to a specific supplier. So again, taking a look at some of the realities around concrete, some concrete manufacturers are vertically organized, and they will be sourcing cement from within their own organization. So just because you see a cement that may be a lower GHG there, that may not really be a reality or a source for them. Secondly, there are some realities of supply chain limitations. So there's only one cement manufacturer in the state of Washington. To build and bring online another cement plant is extremely cost intensive, very long permitting window there. So the reality is that we have some constraints in terms of production, but also some of the cement is, they have long lasting sort of supply agreements with other people, which further constrains where you can source from. So that explains some of the reasons why people are sourcing from Canada or even further afield. One important concept is to avoid prescriptive limits for each and every material within a category. The reality is not every material is going to be able to hit a prescriptive limit due to its application, project specifics, or those sourcing limitations. So it's still important to make meaningful and deep reductions, but in a way that can be achieved through multiple paths. And what I mean by that is, if you're not able to hit a target with a specific material or a specific product within a category, that the general contractor has the ability to compensate in an equal way to hit the overall target. And then finally, the topic of recognizing greenhouse gas sequestration and storage in materials over its entire lifetime came up in discussion. Obviously these bills are very focused on A1 through A3 life cycle stages, which really isn't the big picture. And admittedly, this is a bit of a thorny and tricky issue, but there was discussion about how can legislation give credit and recognize that with some materials, over the lifetime, there is that additional sequestration and storage. So with that, I will hand it over to Monica to talk about the other proviso.